Hey everybody, and welcome to another video in the Magical Elections video series. In this video, we're going to take a look at astrological elections for magical opportunities between July 31st, or the Leo new moon, until August 15th, or the Aquarius full moon. So another 2-week period from a new moon to a full moon this time. And we're going to take a look at what different electional opportunities we have available to us, what we can do with them, that kind of thing. In this 2-week period, we only have 2 electional opportunities presented to us. The sky is just not being super cooperative right now, especially with Jupiter and Saturn both retrograde, which really limits our options. So before we get into the magical elections for this 2-week period and talk about them, I wanted to take a minute to talk about Cazimi, what it is, how it's useful, and what the purpose of it is. Cazimi is an astrological term that gets kind of thrown out a lot, and people are like, oh, an astrological term that I'm not familiar with. This person who used it must be very educated. And while that's not necessarily untrue, there's a lot of it's most likely that people just don't really know what to do with Cazimi. It's really just a terminology that they throw out to be able to use it. But specifically within the context of astrological magic, what is Cazimi? What is its focus? What does it do? So taking a step back from just talking about it within an astrological magic context, Cazimi is when a planet is within 16 minutes of the sun, so within 16 minutes of a conjunction with the sun. For those of you who may be a bit newer to astrology, you may be familiar with the idea that there are different degrees in the zodiac, right? Like the sun can be at 22 degrees Cancer, or the moon can be at 3 degrees Taurus. This idea that zodiac signs are subdivided into individual degrees, and there are 30 of them in each sign, and every sign has 30 degrees. But Cazimi is 16 minutes of arc. So the minutes of arc are a further subdivision of the degrees. So every sign has 30 degrees within it, and every degree has 60 minutes of arc. So it's an even more smaller and even more fine method of measurement. And so when we're talking about Cazimi, or planets being Cazimi, we're talking about them being almost exactly conjoined with the sun. And the purpose of this, the whole idea of what Cazimi does, is every planet has a synodic cycle with the sun, and this is something that I've talked a little bit about in other videos about like the moon, things like that. And what happens is that the Cazimi point, the point when a planet is exactly conjoined with the sun, is the beginning and the ending point of a cycle. It's the end of one cycle and the start of another cycle. Because of this, the Cazimi point itself is kind of seen as like a union with the divinity, a union with the sun that is best exemplified through the planet. So when we think about synodic cycles, or with planets and their relationship with the sun, as they move through this relationship, it's almost analogous to a life cycle. When planets are on one side of the sun, they're new, they're young, they're fresh, they're energetic. When they're on the other side of the sun, they're more old, lethargic, that kind of thing. So you see how the life cycle analogy kind of plays out. You see it a lot more clearly with the moon. When the moon is waxing, she's growing in light. This is like her young moon phase as she reaches maturity at the full moon, and then she wanes and she decreases in vitality and light, which is like an old moon, or like an old lady moon, basically. And so the Cazimi point is kind of the death point and the subsequent rebirth point all in one. As planets apply to the sun, apply to the Cazimi, they symbolically die, and as they separate from the sun, they are symbolically reborn. So that moment, that sort of exact moment, or closest to exact moment that you can get with Cazimi, is like the union of the spirit of the planet with the spirit of divinity itself. And it's supposed to be incredibly powerful and incredibly intensifying and incredibly purifying. And that's really the focus of what Cazimi elections and Cazimi rituals are for. And we'll talk about it a little bit more later, because the reason that I'm talking about it at all is we're going to experience Venus's Cazimi, or the restart of the Venus cycle in her synodic cycle with the sun. So we'll talk about that as we get closer to that. But before we do, obviously we have to talk about our elections up until that point in time, and from the Leo new moon until the Aquarius full moon, obviously we are working with a waxing moon phase. So here we're working on talismans, or elections that are more growth oriented, more about gaining and increase and stability, which is more what a waxing moon is for. As the moon waxes and increases in light, so too do things in nature naturally move towards a sense of fullness and growth and completion. So that's what we're focused on today. Okay, so moving into our magical elections for this 2-week period, our first one is going to be a Lunar Mansion election. We're pretty familiar with these. They're definitely the bulk of my elections that I share with you guys. And so for this one specifically, we're talking about an 18th Lunar Mansion talisman. And so the 18th Lunar Mansion is Alcalb, or the heart, and it's situated in the Scorpio sign. And what we're focused on here is the moon here at 15 degrees Scorpio, so in that lunar mansion, within the 18th lunar mansion, with the moon on the ascendant as kind of close as we can get it. And the reason why we're focused on Scorpio ascendant is because of Mars's placement. Mars, as the ruler of the first house, is not ill-placed here. He's strong in the 10th house, and he's not so close to the sun as to be completely debilitated by it. So that's good. That's what we're focused on. At the same time, the moon is actually going to apply a square to Mars. And while typically squares to Mars are more concerning aspects, we usually don't want to see, especially health-related aspects, or health-related talismans, I'm sorry, being involved in difficult aspects with Mars. In this instance, it's not so bad. One, Mars is the lord of the first house, so there's kind of that similitude between the person who the talisman is going to be for and Mars, kind of that sharing, so it's not so bad. And then also at the same time, the moon is actually in Scorpio, and Scorpio is the sign or the domicile of Mars. More contemporarily, we would refer to it as the rulership of Mars. Mars rules Scorpio. And so what happens here is that there is a different kind of relationship between the moon and Mars because of the moon being placed here. And this is what's classically referred to as reception. So when one planet is in the dignities of another planet, like the moon being in Scorpio, the domicile of Mars, that second planet, Mars in this instance, has to take care of the moon, has to take care of its guest. So when we're talking about squares or oppositions with Mars, if they happen from signs that Mars has authority in, they're not so bad. Mars has to kind of rein it in and take care of the planet who he's in aspect with in that case. So in this case, because the moon is in Scorpio, Mars has to take care of the moon and kind of holds back from being too rough or mean to her. So even if Mars didn't rule the first house in this chart, which he does, the square with Mars wouldn't be as bad because of the reception involved. But because we have the reception and the Mars square being lord of the first house, it's fine. It's fine. So when we're talking about Alcalb, the 18th mansion, it's a very health-based talisman, and this is kind of something that I mentioned recently in my interview with Nina Griffin about the Lunar Mansion talismans, is that the 18th mansion is kind of one of 3 health-based talismans, but the 18th mansion is much more focused on a surgical kind of approach to getting rid of something or to healing something. And you can see it in the imagery. Alcalb, the 18th mansion, its image is that of a snake, a coiled up snake with its tail above its head. And this is kind of how the 18th mansion acts to things. It's much more predatory in nature. It kind of slinks in, devours the problem, and then kind of continues to look for problems if there aren't any. And if there are any, it continues to look for problems. And even if there aren't any, it can lash out. So in this instance, the 18th mansion is in itself much more martial and much more predatory and much more seeking what it's looking for. So it's important that if you make an 18th lunar mansion, in my opinion, that you have in mind very specifically what it's for, like you're sick with a specific thing and you want to get better from that thing, and then once you feel better, to dismiss the talisman. Don't let it hang around. So that's my my word of warning based on my own personal experiences with the 18th mansion. It's very effective in what it does, but it just doesn't stop. Our second astrological election opportunity for this 2-week period is actually for the 24th mansion of the moon. And the 24th mansion is one that's very much focused on multiplication of opportunities, or multiplication in general. It's a very prolific talisman, very prolific energy. And the primary focus of it is usually on protection or accumulation of resources, but it can also be used other ways, like for career opportunities or things like that. There's definitely wiggle room, kind of only limited by your creativity to fit within the main theme. So our focus in this election is with the moon, as always, placed here in the 24th mansion in the 10th house, very close to the MC degree, so culminating very strongly. And in this instance, she is applying a sextile to the newly stationed direct Jupiter. So thank God we've got that finally going for us now. And we can make some use out of this planet that we were just kind of ignoring for 3 months. At the same time, we're always kind of focused on our Lord of the First House as a representative of the individual who is going to wear the talisman or is making the talisman. And here we have Taurus rising, so we look to Venus here in the 4th house. Venus is in Leo and very closely conjoined the sun, close enough to be Cazimi. And you have to really be careful when it comes to conjunctions with the sun, because if they are beyond the 16-minute mark, if Venus had been, more than 16 minutes away from the sun, we would actually be in the territory of another another cynotic relationship that is called combustion, which ranges from 7.5 degrees away from the sun to 16 minutes away from the sun. So we have combustion, which is bad, which eventually gives way to Cazimi, which is good. And the reason why combustion is bad is because it represents two very vulnerable stages within a life cycle. So as I mentioned earlier, when we're talking about Cazimi as being like the birth-death point, so if the union with the sun is that end and beginning of a cycle, then as the planet moves towards the sun, here we're talking about somebody who is approaching death, somebody who is ill and weak and basically on their deathbed. Obviously, that's a very vulnerable time, and we don't want that kind of symbolism to be woven into an astrological talisman almost at all. On the other hand, when a planet separates from the sun and has just been reborn, the life stage that's most analogous here is of a newborn infant. And obviously there's a lot of vulnerability involved in that, and we don't want that kind of symbolism woven into the talisman either. We want to wait until the planet has moved a little further to get past that vulnerable infancy stage symbolically. So I say all that to say within 16 minutes of the sun is good. Further than that is bad. So all that symbolism on top of each other, the Lord of the first house being well placed in an angular house and a decent sign for itself, powerfully conjoined the sun, and with the moon in the 10th house being the sextile with Jupiter here, this is a very good opportunity to take to make a 24th mansion talisman, to find yourself some new opportunities, to like stretch out there, especially for individuals who do like freelance work. Absolutely do this, or just for individuals who are looking to make more money. And this election is on August 14th around mid-afternoon, or I'm sorry, around midnight. So our next election is actually not for a talisman, but it is the moment that Venus and the sun are exactly conjoined, are exactly Cazimi. And this is a really important point in any cyclic cycle, like I mentioned before. This is the end of one cycle and the beginning of another cycle. And you can see that here with Venus and the sun, both exactly in the same degree, 21, and minute of the sign Leo. So what ends up happening here, or why this is important, I don't necessarily recommend making a talisman during this time, because a lot of the talismanic needs are not met, either for the sun or Venus. Like at my time, this happens just an hour later than the previous election that we showed about the 24th mansion talisman. So at my time, it's a Mars day, it's a Mercury hour, not very helpful, and the moon is not connected to these planets. The moon is applying the sextile to Jupiter still, so it's not otherwise involved with the sun or Venus, which makes it a bad time to make a talisman for Venus Cazimi. But what it is a good time for is a cleansing of Venus talismans, of Venus petitions, of Venus iconography or materia. It's very much about taking and releasing the old and reinfusing those Venus type talismans with a new type of energy, or a renewed Venus cycle spirit. So one thing to keep in mind also with Venus and Mercury is that they actually conjoin the sun twice during their phases, because Venus and Mercury are on that side of the Earth with the sun. And so it's like, we have the sun, Mercury, Venus, and then the Earth. Because they're on that side, their orbits from the geocentric perspective look like they contact the sun twice. Whereas Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and even the outer planets, which are on the other side of the Earth and sun, they only conjoin once throughout their rotation. But the second conjunction, where Mercury and Venus are retrograde, is not a renewal. It is not the beginning of the cyclic cycle. It only happens when Venus and Mercury are direct. So what do you do? What's the plan here when you have a planet that's Cazimi? Cazimis are great times for purification and renewal of an astrological talisman and a recommitment to its goals or its purpose. So if you have Venus talismans around that you've made in the past, and you want to kind of supercharge them or renew or revitalize them, this is definitely the opportunity to do that. And your ritual may look different, but I always try to do it exactly during the Cazimi period itself. And my kind of operational mode, like what I'm doing, the way that I structure it is, as Venus is approaching the sun, I have Venus incenses out, and I recite the Orphic hymn to Venus at least 7 times, which is annoying because the Venus hymn is long as fuck. And I also have a specific candle set aside to represent the sun during this time period. And so I'm, introducing the ring or the talisman to the instant smoke, and I'm doing the hymn, and at the same time, I'm sort of moving the Venus ring over the flame of the candle to represent the sun. So as Venus kind of gets closer to it, I move the ring closer and closer to the flame until it's exactly on it at the time, which was 1:14 a.m. for me. And then I have a very specific prayer that I say to the ring, just as a, thank you, out with the old, in with the new kind of thing. And I just sort of focus and meditate on that until Venus moves past the sun, just 1 minute past the sun. And then I just kind of conclude from there. So it's very much just a ritual that's focused on washing and cleaning, which is also something that I do with my talismanic jewelry during the Cazimi periods. I clean them and I wash them during this time, and just kind of like make them refreshed and new. And it's definitely something I recommend doing for anybody who has talismanic planetary pieces that can dip into this really powerful symbolism. So before I wrap up today, I wanted to take a second to talk about a couple of things, one of which is why there are no Sun and Leo talismans during this time period. And even though this time period covers, the Sun in Leo, and by the time we get to the Aquarius full moon, for which this video covers, the Sun will be at like 23 degrees Leo, so we're almost done. And we might not have any Leo talismans available to us during this time period because of this. And this that I'm talking about is Venus. So one of the really important pieces of an astrological talisman, of a planetary astrological talisman, is that the moon is immediately applying to the planet for who you're trying to make a talisman of. So in this case, since we're trying to make Sun and Leo talismans, we want the moon to immediately apply to the sun. But Venus is getting all up in the way every time. And this is just kind of what happens when you have a planet that's close to the sun like this. So like you have the sun at 14 degrees, but Venus is hanging out very close, like all the time at 12 degrees, or something very, very close, something not very far away, which makes it to where you only have a couple of hours of time to where the moon can apply to the sun without Venus interfering. So like in this example, I have Venus and the sun here on the ascendant, and this is something that I could potentially use for a talisman, but I've got the moon at 11 degrees Scorpio, and she's going to apply to the square of Venus before she applies to the square of the sun. So that's frustrating. And even then, if I was like, okay, well, I'll wait until we get to until the moon gets past, and like that's something you can definitely do that, I guess, but you'll run into some issues there. Like I just moved the chart to be able to do that, and here we have the moon at 13 degrees Scorpio, and Venus is at 12 degrees and 57 minutes Leo. So the moon is past Venus' square. That's good, and it's now applying immediately to the sun. But the sun's conjoined the 12th house cusp, and that's like, you can't use that. That's not like, you can't do that at all. And then just trying to move it further, you can get the sun further into the 11th. And even here, I guess, close to the 10th without it being the sun's hour or day, which isn't very effective. And then by the time you get the sun all the way to the midheaven to where it is a sun day or a sun hour during this day, then you've missed it. The moon is now at 15 degrees Scorpio and the sun is at 14 degrees Leo. So the moon is separated from the sun. And that's just kind of like the constant problem that you have with Leo talismans, or with the sun and Leo talismans this year. Just Venus kind of getting in the way and being there. It might get a little bit easier as we get to the end of Leo season and Venus now is behind the sun, so not interfere, but that remains to be seen. And then finally, the other thing that I wanted to talk about really quickly is just the problem with retrograde planets. Why, like, they're just super annoying, and another thing that we kind of have to deal with. So right now we have Jupiter in Sagittarius and Saturn in Capricorn, but they're both retrograde, which renders them basically useless through astrological talismans. And it even interferes with things like Lunar Mansion talismans. So for instance, like this chart I had pulled up here would be a really great time to do a 20th Mansion talisman for the attainment of goals. But Jupiter is retrograde and you cannot use that. I mean, I guess to be more technical, Jupiter is stationed, but is still that retrograde motion. So like you can't use this. And you have a similar story for the 22nd mansion, which is good for wellness, with Saturn being there, Saturn being retrograde. Again, we can't use that. Luckily, we're about to the end of those cycles where Jupiter will station direct during this 2-week period, and then Saturn will station direct as the sun gets through mid-Virgo. So we're only a little bit left to hang in there, and then we can make it and actually utilize these planets because they are really well placed. They're in their signs of domicile, so we can use them as planets to connect to well for lunar mansions. and even be able to bring back the opportunity of planetary talismans, featuring them again. But this whole kind of 4-month period that we've been dealing with from like April until now we just haven't been able to do anything with them. All right, so that's about all I have for you today. Look forward to more Jupiter and Saturn talismans coming in the coming months, and I will see you guys again on the Aquarius full moon.